Okay, cool. We're ready?
Thumbs up.
Okay, awesome. So thanks everyone for coming. I know it's been 3 semi-long days, so appreciate that you guys are around. So let's kick it off. What are we going to be talking about today? So I think the main objective of this talk is going to be kind of dissecting where we stand with regards to decentralized networks, the use and participation in them. So specifically what we're going to be doing is dissecting recent trends and then taking a specific look at what the role of the application layer is in fostering participation and utilization. So before we dive in, let's do a quick show of hands. Who here owns tokens themselves? Good. Who in here has actually been using them for network native functions? That could be staking, delegation, voting. All right, so we already see in this room that there's a bit of a discrepancy here. We have kind of active token holders and something that could be classified as more passive token holding. So one of the things that we kind of want to dissect is why is that? What is kind of the separation that we see and how can we encourage better adoption and utilization across decentralized networks? So before we kick off, let's do a really quick recap of kind of what's been going on. So for that, let's dissect kind of the first era that we've observed and kind of all been part of, right? We kind of dub it the Wild West. Why the Wild West? We've seen a lot of interesting trends, a lot of innovation, but also a lot of skepticism that has kind of induced somewhat of a stigma around token distributions, how they should be carried out, utilization, and the regulatory environment. So let's kick it off with kind of 2012 to 2018. So what was kind of trends that we observed during these timelines? It was the phase of the ICO craze, the total absence of regulation in that context, and a lot of innovation, but also no regulation on how this should be done in a compliant and accountable way, how we can induce and create transparency standards for token networks and when they launch to mainnet. One of the other things that was observed in those early times of innovation was a lot of the networks that were launching token distributions weren't really at a stage of technical maturity that allowed these tokens to actually be used, right? So let's kind of dissect some of the trends that we saw during this era. What is a token? This thing is new. Let me figure out what it is. Where can I go and buy it, right? And then what is its use? And oftentimes the answer to that was kind of, I don't really know where to use it because there's no mainnet ready for me to do so. So next up, where can I go and trade it? Or where can I go and sell it? So where do we stand today? And I think that's kind of dissecting what we've kind of dubbed the age of use, right? Why the age of use? We've seen a maturation in the design of decentralized networks and a lot more sound incentive mechanism design that is encouraging participation in these networks. We've also seen the response of, I guess, the first phase from a regulatory perspective that initially was fully absent to something that has evolved into a lot more scrutiny without necessarily providing the necessary guidance or formal standards of how they should be conducted. So we're seeing a lot less in terms of, tokens being distributed across the markets, but we are seeing the rise of interesting trends in the ecosystem, predominantly the rise of proof of stake, and the evolution of delegate work entities to facilitate and enable the ecosystem. So this is kind of the trends that come with this era, right? It's predominantly, okay, these tokens now have use. That's great. What can I use them for? And then where can I go and actually use them? And I think the last point here is something that we want to dive in, especially as it relates to the application layer's role in enabling it.
So during this time period, or this, I guess, evolutionary of chapters, there's been a couple different things. There's been a few different things that have grown that are new, that have all been kind of working in unison to get to where we're at today, and we'll dissect those different pieces. So let's talk about the road to proof of stake and kind of how we got here and how long it took. 2012 we can consider to be essentially the genesis, which is Peercoin was represented and put forth into the community, which was one of the first proof of stake ideations. 2014 we can consider to be iteration, which was the release of the Tendermint white paper and also delegated proof of stake through BitShares. These were all, I guess the most important thing to talk about at the beginning of this is most things that are innovative, they were done individually and not collectively. 2017, this was more of when a collective effort around this really began to bubble and take place. More people were participating in the effort, doing research, and the two primary efforts taking place during that time period were Casper FFG and CBC, which is now ETH2, and Aurora Bourse, which will eventually be Cardano. I'm not sure when, but sometime in the near future. 2019 we can think of as implementation. This was when proof-of-stake networks for the first time actually began to go live. People were actively staking inside of these systems, and mainnets were there. Most notable, Cosmos, Tezos, from a layer 1 perspective, and then layer 2 solutions built on top of Ethereum being Lumen Matic. Other ones, but those are probably the best way to divide up the first implementation of proof of stake is existing and competing layer 1s to Ethereum, and then additionally Ethereum helpers, you could say. 2020 is now where we are today. There are more proof of stake networks that are set to launch this year, most notably ETH2, the Scale network, and then Polkadot. Again, Scale being elastic sidechains, an Ethereum helper, ETH2 helping itself, but still needs plenty of help from others. And then Polkadot essentially as being a competing layer 1. So it's taken us 8 years to get to full implementation, and now proof of stake is considered to be the standard. And if you do anything in the proof of work realm, it's not quite strange, but it's you have to take different approaches to proof of work, and research efforts on that end have lessened, and pretty much all the brightest minds are looking at proof of stake today. So let's talk about some numbers, because everyone in the DeFi space loves to talk about value locked or associated market cap or different things. Not, in my opinion, the best way to look at it, but it's a relative growth metric, and we're humans, so it makes sense. So as of today, these are all updated as of today, right before the chat. The total crypto market cap globally is 260 billion. Of that, the staking market cap is 15.9 billion, which is about 5.7%. Now, if we dissected those numbers further and said, what is the market cap of proof of stake compared to the top 10 or the top 100, these numbers would be much higher from that perspective. The more interesting thing to look at is of all the live staking networks that exist, how much is actually locked in staking, which right now is about 67%. Which is quite interesting. So that means that the ones that have gone and launched, we are seeing a lot of participation in them. But a more interesting metric, which we are spending time digging into, is exactly how many individuals are participating inside of that high stake rate. How centralized is it? How has the distribution evolved from its initial distribution? And are all the people staking inside of these networks just early purchasers who are basically restricting the liquidity of the token and to some degree restricting participation upon others? The bottom chart here is just kind of just a visual representation of just all the most prominent staking tokens and how much they're locked in. And as you can see, we started from 0, and now we're at 16 billion, which is quite interesting.
So now that we've kind of dissected the rise, I guess, of a market cap that is currently sitting in proof-of-stake-based protocols, one of the main things that we've observed with this is a trend in the emergence of delegate work entities. So what are delegate work entities? They're basically providers, infrastructure runners, those that enable the staking environment by providing infrastructure, either directly or by accepting delegation, or providing these for other participants. So as you can see, I really love this chart, but it's a stakeholder group that is really diverse. It's a Web3 business model that has evolved native to some of these as a core business function. And then we've kind of seen the evolution and hybridization for other parts of this ecosystem. If you look at custodians and exchanges, they're kind of the new kids on the staking block. That have kind of evolved into providing staking infrastructure and staking services as kind of in tandem to their existing business models. Another interesting function is that of, I guess, like, what is the role of the VC in Web3 context, and how has their model evolved? One of the interesting things that we're seeing is that capital providers are now increasingly becoming work-providing entities, right? Running their own infrastructure or delegating to infrastructure providers. So in that sense, we're seeing capital provider work entities evolve, which is kind of a hybridization of a Web3 approach of what VCs are kind of evolving into. The main thing that kind of to point out here is, as we see different parts of this stack, I guess, evolve, and something that we'll dive in a bit deeper, each of these have their own customer acquisition channels, right? And their own incentives in ensuring participation with different sizes and different economies of scale. So lastly, I guess, wrapping up the first two topics that we've kind of talked about, the rise of proof of stake, tightening of the regulatory environment, and lastly, I guess, the way that different kinds of stakeholders play a critical role in enabling use for these decentralized networks, let's talk a little bit about token distribution models. So I guess everyone here is familiar with the ICO. And pretty much everyone should also be familiar with the kind of passive airdrop we've seen in the early days, right? You know, airdrop tokens, see if they stick, see if people actually want them. You know, mostly they didn't, but that's fine. So kind of let's dissect what some of the trends are that we're observing. And I guess the first chart is a pretty good overview of that. So if you look at the little green bar there, we've seen a proportional increase in the rise over the last 2 years in interactive airdrops. Interactive airdrops are kind of targeted at encouraging self-selected user groups that may have a higher potential and are better, I guess, equipped to support networks with active participation, which is critical, number one, in the phase of bootstrapping, but number two, also from a regulatory analysis perspective. We've seen really interesting proposals come out of this. So LivePeer is an example of, you know, an interactive airdrop. NewCipher has a really interesting model called the work lock, which is basically incentivizing collateralization by building in a use element into the token distribution. Why? Because it deters speculation, because it supports an initial distribution that goes out to representatives that are active participants in the network and encouraging that use and bootstrapping in the beginning. Proof of use is one of the bigger elements of what we push in consensus and what we've kind of come out of multiple years of researching the best way of doing an initial token distribution should look like. You can think of proof of use as a programmable mechanism. Anyone who purchases tokens in a sale is basically required to use their tokens before they're able to use them outside of the network or for trading purposes. Why is that important? Again, the regulatory environment kind of setting the standards and ensuring that everyone who purchases tokens is actually using them. So that's something that we've pioneered before with projects such as Foam and something that we're doing with our partners at scale, which is going to be rolling out in Q2 of this year.
So let's take a look at what the next chapter looks like. I personally think that, and would love to know if people agree, but we're approaching adoption territory. Right now, there's probably only 1 million global users of crypto. There may be 10 to 12 million people who have interacted with it, but the core community is probably only like 1 million people. So how do we get to where we need to be, and what are some of the important steps to get there? So as we talked about chapter 1, chapter 2, 20, who knows when, hopefully soon, is the point that hopefully you're purchasing your coffee with crypto, or you're interacting on a daily basis with the blockchain in some format, and hopefully it's invisible to you. Because if it's not, then we won't ever actually reach to where we want to get. So let's talk about the bridge. Some of the biggest, we spent loads of time doing user research on all different types of users. Crypto bubble users, outside users, different countries, different age brackets, pretty much everything. And it's quite interesting to see where things sit and what people are having trouble with. I think everyone knows that a general education barrier in blockchain is extremely difficult to get over. This is essentially from an innovation perspective, basically everything that humans have ever created packed into one technology. So explaining this to someone when it's supposed to be abstracted away, when it's not, is quite difficult. So education's always been a big issue in blockchain, and I think it's getting better, but it's still one of the major points that we've come across in our research. When it comes to specifically the topic of launching tokens and participating in networks, regulation's a problem. There is just no guidance whatsoever, and hopefully that improves itself, but we personally think that is one of the major things blocking innovation in this category is that if you do this process wrong, like the risk is that like you potentially end up in jail. And like who wants to innovate if that's like the actual worst case scenario? It's an issue. The other one being, which is what we'll dig into next, is the most recent problem, which is fragmentation. Essentially, when it comes to the application layer, what we've seen is everyone's building their own front ends. And as a user, I'm so overwhelmed with where to go to use my thing that I actually may end up not ever using it. Or I've used my thing on 6 different platforms and I have no idea where my things are, or what they're worth today, or how to track them and how to find them. Fragmentation is a huge problem. And just honestly, general UX and UI, which is something that like the guys at Deep Work are actually doing an amazing job with, and that's how do you design applications to interact with the blockchain from a Web 2 perspective, and how do you bridge the design gap? There's loads of work being done on interactive design and also like human coordination at that level and how to get these things done. UX UI will be a big category in 2020. It'll, in my opinion, be kind of one of those sleepers that most people won't notice it's there until it's like, wow, look at this application. I'm interacting with the blockchain for the first time and it's a lot better than what it used to be. These are the 4 major points, and we'll kind of get into what that looks like today.
Cool. Where's the party at? I guess this kind of wraps up the discussion point that Colin just mentioned, which is where do I go and use it now that the thing has use, right? We kind of dissected how the ecosystem of stakeholders look that currently support infrastructure, staking provision, any kind of delegate work entity services, right? It's a really diverse universe. Another thing that is kind of happening as we see everyone, I guess, trying to acquire a user base across all of these services to maintain and run their businesses, everyone's building their own applications to make that an easy access point. So who are the players? We kind of touched on them earlier. Exchanges and custodians are kind of moving into the proof of stake phase, providing staking services through their channels, through their products. In general, I mean, I think it does create easier use for participants who are already part of these ecosystems, who are already part of these products, of these providers, right? It's easier for me to go to a single, like, unified platform to stake, trade, exchange, buy, right? In a lot of ways that makes the adoption a little bit easier. But one of the things that we're kind of seeing with that is it is leading to a point where if these providers are also running infrastructure and providing those services, we see a lot of market capture in that area. And one of the things that we've kind of seen with that is, I guess, Binance is a prominent example. These kinds of providers have economies of scale that a lot of other smaller players don't have. So going for a 0% commission rate could be great for user adoption, but really not so great for decentralization and preventing the crowding out of smaller players who are really important to facilitating decentralization in these networks in the longer run. What's next? So network portals. We've kind of seen networks build their own application layers to access and encourage participation with them that kind of provide an interface that allows all providers and supporters in the network to post their services, right? So we've seen that with LivePeer, we've seen it with Loom. You have kind of a native network dashboard that you can kind of operate from, and it's great because in one way, it makes it easy for you to select providers based on parameters that are important to you, whether that's performance, risk assessment, and it provides transparency and better competition in the market. One of the drawbacks is if all of these network native portals are being built by all of these networks, what am I going to use a different portal for each of the networks that I'm a part of? It doesn't really seem conducive, right? To have access points and engagement points if I'm like a multi-token holder. So that's kind of one thing. The other thing that we've kind of seen, and especially with some of the partners that we're working with, is there is this kind of impending question around centralization / what is the effort of protocol teams in building and maintaining access portals to participate in these networks, and how does that kind of play and weigh against the classification of whether or not that is a centralized effort from a regulatory perspective. Last but not least, this is kind of the biggest category where we see a lot of innovation and a lot of diversity. It's the staking providers, the ones to whom providing infrastructure for staking services is native to their business model. And one of the things that we've seen is, as all of these staking providers support multiple networks, they're also building multiple interfaces and applications to access and participate in all of these networks, right? To me as a user, going across this to try and roam out and find out who I should be staking with can be quite tedious, and it's encouraging the fragmentation that we're generally seeing in the market. So it's not necessarily conducive to the end user to make it easy for them to understand the opportunities to aggregate them and execute on them, right? For the protocol teams and infrastructure providers themselves, building and spending time and resources on building out these front-end applications carries a significant customer acquisition cost, right? In a way, a lot of those resources are diverged from spending time on building infrastructure, critical things that are kind of the core functions of what these providers are in the ecosystem for in the first place. So I guess what's the point that we're trying to make? We're seeing kind of early trends of fragmentation as everyone is kind of going into the realms of identifying the best application layers to interact with different protocols. For the end user with, a multi-token portfolio, it's really not that easy anymore for me to understand where to go, where to use, what to do. And at this point, using multiple interfaces and applications to interact with the underlying protocols and become an active participant. At net, that may actually not be that conducive to the adoption that we're all kind of driving towards.
So just to kind of recap, and we'll bring all this together, and now we'll kind of show you, what is Activate and how are we helping address these problems in the industry, and how are we bringing parties together to solve these problems. You can think of Activate as a unified platform that brings together the three key parties of enabling a decentralized network to be healthy and have usage inside of it. That is your token holders, that is your infrastructure providers or delegate work entities, and that is the protocol itself, and partnering with them to help with these steps. Across the sphere of users, each of them, kind of has their own intentions and their own desires as to what they want to do. It's to increase participation, it must be made as easy for the user to enter the system and bootstrap that system. They need to be given Web 2-like interfaces and Web 2-like experiences where they can do everything inside of their one home. As a validator, as Mara explained, there's some things that are core and there are some things that are not core to you. One of the not core things is that you shouldn't feel the need to build your own large-scale platform. If you want a front end for certain clients and individuals, that makes sense, but this is more as a helper to those entities to deliver more traffic to them that they would have never seen before, but also give the user the optionality to choose their provider, which essentially creates a system of incentives where the users are actually checking in on the validators. They're judging them based on their performance, and it allows a healthier market for validators to act more honest because it's all displayed and open in the front. And ultimately, the last player here is a decentralized network. Bootstrapping your network from the very beginning is very difficult to do. It's an orchestration event you build for many years to actually get to that point, and it's mission critical that you see large percentages of utilization at the beginning, and it's done in a safe manner. So these are the three users that we're here to bring together and bootstrap and launch networks for the future. This is kind of what the UI and UX will look like, and this is kind of like a participation portal, you can think of it. Activate supports networks. I'm the token holder of that network. I can come in and I'm given user level data, I'm given network level data, and then I'm given network native functions that I can do to interact with that network and support it. From the staking sense, I can earn rewards. From the voting sense, also governance is heading in that direction as well. But this is the look and the feel of a repeatable platform for multi-networks that allows the user to not deal with fragmentation, but still receive optionality. And it allows it to be cost-free for the user, and that's the most important person to focus on. So thanks, everyone. I know it's been a super long week, and I'm sure everyone's heard millions of talks, so thanks for sticking around. You can get at us on Telegram, or you can check it out on Activate. As Mara said, our first partner is Scale. We will be supporting them and doing things at the end of Q2. We'll be releasing more specific information as to when the launch is going to happen and what the details of it are. So please jump on the website and help join and build this ecosystem out with us.
If you want to learn more about Scale,
Stands up
the
next.
two guys in the Scale shirts are yours.
I doubt we have time for questions, yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
le USB qui est là, c'est fini. Je leur demande